So we're going to go ahead and demo the start of the HTML file for you to be able to do your floating and clearing assignment. And this is just, setting up a file so that we can later use CSS. So we're just going to walk through a few of these steps and then hopefully help you out with that. So we do have the basics set up. So we've got the doc type, the HTML tag that has a language attribute, the head tag, the character set, and then the link to our style sheet. So this we can test in our next demo when we start getting into the CSS side of things. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and set up the basics of HTML to get us going. So we're going to start out by creating a containing div. And the way this is going to work is we are going to have a div and we're going to apply an ID to it. An ID can only be used once per page. Usually it's going to be used with something either that's high priority or perhaps something that has something interactive within it. So this is going to act as our container. There are several different uses of containers. One example might be if you know your width of your page is going to be identical, we can set a container for everything that's inside of it. So that is our main purpose of using this today. But in some cases, we'll actually use another container, which we'll set up in just a second. We're going to move on to actually nesting things inside of this containing div. So I'll add a few extra spaces, and then we're going to go ahead and add our header. And then we're just going to put some placeholder text in there, just because when we first start out, it may not appear on our page if we don't do this. So we do want to make sure that we have content in until we start adding either different kinds of content or images, etc., or even pictures that might be through CSS, or it could be text. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my nav now. And we could add in a list-based navigation like you guys have done in previous assignments, but this is just going to act as our placeholder for our navigation for now. So that we can focus on the bigger priority, which is creating our layout. So we're going to add in a section, and if you've never used sections, you can think of them a lot like divs. Essentially, all of these elements we're adding can act a lot like a box. So I'm actually going to give this a class called box1, and this is going to act as a container for me as well. So inside of section, I'm going to have a div. And we're going to call the first one, we're going to assign a name called left, because we're going to float it to the left. And you could be more semantic with naming this, whatever your content is. It might be a sidebar, or it might be, something specific to the page that is more descriptive. But for the sake of today, it makes sense of showing you this based off of what we're trying to achieve. And then this one's going to be float right. So each of these actually have to open and then close, and we will come in and add some content in just a second. Okay, so you'll notice section contains the left one, which is going to be our left side of our page, and then our right side of our page. So the power behind this is, with it being inside of that container, we have a lot of control to be able to keep this together, and then later we're going to learn a technique called clear fix. So we do actually need them to be in a container so that that container can clear it with CSS, which we'll go into that concept in a little bit more detail in the CSS version of the screencast in a bit. So let's just finish setting up this HTML so we can move on to CSS shortly. So we do have to have a footer. Now your footer does in this example, it is placed inside of our div that is our container. Okay, so that's going to hold it all together. There, again, are a lot of different examples, and as you start to build responsive websites, which is a little bit more of an intermediate to advanced concept, there are a lot of examples where you may actually have each section have its own container, or the footer could act as its own container and not necessarily be nested inside of main. So that is something that we will talk about later in another demo as well, but just for the sake of getting through showing you the basic concept of floating and clearing, this is going to help you out. So with that said, we do have to have content. I do have another file already set up with a lot of these tags and stuff put together. So I've got 2 paragraphs, and I'm just going to copy over 2 paragraphs, and you can get this through Lorem Ipsum. You do want to make sure you mark up your paragraphs so they have a opening and a closing paragraph tag, and just make sure all of your tags as you're going through are opened and closed. So we'll go back over here and we'll take these, and then we'll go ahead and put those in that right section. Okay, so again, if you don't want to type text, because I don't expect you to, you could actually go look up some Lorem Ipsum online and copy 2 paragraphs. It doesn't have to be a ton, but just enough to be able to hold content. And then the last thing we're going to go ahead and add in is the footer. And the footer basically needs to just have a couple links for now. We will talk about later how we can be a little bit more specific with styling links in certain sections of our page. So that's that. We'll go ahead and save it. Now we have not added any CSS, even though we've already linked to this CSS. So with that said, it should not have any CSS when we link it up. Let me just make sure I've turned that off, because I know I'm working with a bunch of different demo files here. So I'm actually going to change the name of this, because I do probably have some CSS in that file from some of my demoing earlier and testing things. So with that said, again, until we actually add CSS, yours is probably going to look like what I'm about to show you now, which is very plain and very simple. But it has the structure that we're going to need, and everything's in place so that as we want to go through, we can call on our IDs or our classes. The nice thing about the classes is once we've set them up, if you feel like you need to reuse them, we're going to be able to reuse them. Okay, and we'll talk more about the CSS setup here shortly. So the first step is obviously creating that HTML file and setting it up. And don't forget, the file, when you save it, needs to be named index.html. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and give you a little bit of time to get this together, and then I'll set up the CSS and walk through a few more steps with you in another step section of this screencast for you.